Russia today completely rejected the new peace proposal developed by Ukraine together with Trump's team and European officials, which was presented yesterday by Volodymyr Zelensky. Today, Putin's spokesperson Dmitry Peskov stated that Moscow does not support the proposal to create a free economic zone in Donbas, which is being considered as part of the joint plan by Ukraine, the US, and the EU. According to him, Russia expects to seize this territory by force and only then begin any negotiations. At the same time, the Kremlin has put forward new demands on Ukraine today as conditions for ending the war. And at the same time, Russians were told that the armed forces of Ukraine were allegedly planning to invade Russia on March 8, 2022. And that's why Russia attacked first, allegedly getting ahead of Ukraine by a whole 2 weeks. But let me remind you that the concentration of Russian troops was taking place in occupied Crimea, along the entire border between Russia and Ukraine, and in Belarus, more than a year before the actual attack. At the same time, in Russia, they are once again assuring Russians that no mobilization is planned. They say it's all Ukrainian disinformation. Well, and the Kremlin publicly accused Russian businesses of not doing enough to protect critical infrastructure from Ukrainian drones. They say Vladimir Putin started the war, but it's the entrepreneurs themselves who should protect facilities from Ukrainian drone strikes. And it got to the point where Putin signed an order according to which Moscow will simply take away businesses if the owner hasn't installed air defense systems to protect it themselves. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss all these topics together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and don't forget to leave your comment. So, now let's go through everything step by step. Moscow does not support the proposal to create a free economic zone in Donbas, which is being considered as part of a joint plan by Ukraine, the US, and the EU. This was stated today by Kremlin spokesperson Dmytro Peskov. The spokesperson for the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin started making up claims that the entire Donbas supposedly belongs to Russia. In addition, he added that the administration of this region cannot be carried out by any third party. Next is a quote from Peskov. In this context, I would still say that Donbas is the territory of the Russian Federation, a subject of the Russian Federation, and it's unlikely that any third party can manage regions of the Russian Federation. Thus, the Kremlin spokesperson responded to the recent statement by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. According to Zelensky, one of the scenarios for ending the war could involve creating a free economic zone in Donbas under the control of a third party. The president of Ukraine clarified that the special envoys of US President Donald Trump, Steven Witkoff and Jared Kushner are offering real scenarios for ending the war. They plan to discuss these proposals not only with Kiev, but also with Moscow. And today it has become known that a mysterious US military plane has landed in Moscow. The Kremlin, through Peskov, said that they have no idea what this is about. Supposedly, there was no such plane, but later it became known that the director of the US Central Intelligence Agency, John Ratcliffe, arrived in Moscow on that plane. And this is the first visit of the CIA chief to Russia since 2021, when the US tried to dissuade the deranged Vladimir Putin from launching a large-scale invasion of Ukraine. Therefore, the negotiation track. At the same time, the Kremlin restated Moscow's main demands to Kiev and the West for ending the war. Let me remind you, the Kremlin expects recognition of Crimea and the occupied parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson regions as Russian territory, the establishment of Ukraine's neutral status and the refusal to join NATO, the reduction of the size of Ukraine's armed forces and the limitation of their capabilities, the cessation of Western arms supplies and intelligence sharing with Kiev, the expansion of the status of the Russian language and additional guarantees for the Russian-speaking population, Ukraine's renunciation of demands for reparations and indemnities, and even the gradual restoration of relations with unwashed, savage Russia and the lifting of all international sanctions against Russia, which, I remind you, actually benefit Russia. Here I'm kinda confused. If the sanctions are beneficial, as Vladimir Putin claimed, then why does the same Putin demand their removal? Does that mean he actually wants to harm Russia? And now the Kremlin is increasing its attempts to intimidate Europe in order to force it to stop helping Ukraine. Russia may resort to semi-military actions against the United Kingdom to force London to stop supporting Ukraine. Kremlin advisor Andrei Fedorov officially made such a threat today. He suggested that British companies producing drones for Ukraine could become targets of attacks from unknown sources, hinting at those very acts of sabotage using unidentified drones. His threat came almost immediately after the statement by the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom Andy Burnham in Kiev on the occasion of Ukraine's Independence Day. As we know, he announced that London had authorized Ukraine to produce Storm Shadow missiles. According to Burnham, the transfer of the relevant technologies has already been approved. Moreover, defense enterprises will be involved in this process. Well, against the backdrop of recent events, Kremlin advisor Fedorov stated that sooner or later there may be not only a verbal but possibly some visible reaction from Russia to the actions in the United Kingdom. Journalists asked this unkempt Fedorov what exactly he meant and what these veiled threats were about. And he replied, quote, "There are various discussions about what this should look like. It could be a so-called technical response, possibly some hacker attacks from an unknown source. Of course, not at the official level. There may be various political steps, and I can't completely rule out that there could be, for example, some kind of semi-military actions." When Fedorov was asked for clarification whether this meant a possible military attack by Russia on British factories directly in the United Kingdom, he replied, quote, "The attack may come not from Russia, but from unknown sources." Well, in other words, Russians as always act like cowards and wimps. Well, in other words, they themselves will never dare to attack openly, but will organize terrorist attacks and sabotage by proxy. Hence, fortunately, these threats from Russian cowardly rats don't scare the British at all. But that's just the real nature of Russians. They don't know how to be brave. You know, they're only brave after the fact. But in the moment, they're not brave, they're cowardly. Let me remind you, when they seized Crimea, for 2 years after the takeover, they kept shouting that it wasn't them, it was the little green men. When the Russians invaded Donbas, for 8 years they kept saying, "What are you talking about? We are not there, it's the militia." Militants who are using the heaviest modern Russian military equipment. As Putin said, ha, they bought it at the army surplus store. So, can you imagine? Well, they act brave later, but in reality, they're just cowardly individuals. And so Fedorov is sitting there, speaking plainly, saying, well, of course, we're making threats openly, but you know, we're actually afraid to attack openly. That's why we're going to organize some sabotage through third parties. Let me remind you, a week earlier, Sergei Lavrov, another Russian embarrassment, stated that Moscow supposedly has information that the US is directly involved in carrying out strikes on Russian territory. He confirmed that Moscow had sent questions to the US State Department regarding arms supplies, intelligence data, and the possible involvement of Washington in strikes on Russian territory on the side of Ukraine, and is now awaiting a response. By the way, no one ever gave them an answer. And what did Lavrov do? Nothing. He just accepted this embarrassment and moved on. In addition, Lavrov threatened that the Russian Federation would toughen its approach in order to destroy everything that fuels Kyiv's war machine from the West. Next, I'll quote him. "We're already doing this, and they're already starting to moan. And it's no coincidence that more and more voices from different parts of our common space are calling to stop immediately. That won't happen. For Russia, a ceasefire along the line of contact is unacceptable." Now, I'm curious, who and where exactly, as Lavrov put it, is starting to moan? Well, in the next episode, by the way, we'll discuss yesterday's meeting of the Coalition of the Willing, where they made decisions about strengthening air defense, transferring missiles during joint military exercises, and so on. This is what Lavrov calls moaning. Let me remind you, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, announced the day before that Ukraine is preparing new proposals to end the war with Russia, which were developed together with the envoys of US President Donald Trump and European officials. According to him, the plan provides for a ceasefire and mutual withdrawal of troops, with the creation of a free economic zone in the vacated territories. Here is a quote from Zelensky. That is, we and the Russians take the same steps back, and this creates a kind of buffer under some sort of supervision. It's not clear yet under whose supervision exactly, but it's some kind of third party. The third part of this plan concerns security guarantees from the European Union and NATO, and the steps that Ukraine is ready to take. At the same time, Zelensky said that the US has several more proposals for ending the war, but, quote, they want to find the right moment to share them. Meanwhile, the Kremlin rejects this peace plan, and they are urging Russians not to panic under any circumstances. The reports about preparations for a new mobilization in Russia are misinformation being spread to destabilize the situation in the country. This was stated today by Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov. Here is his quote. All of this is being spread by the Ukrainian authorities. Naturally, the Kiev regime is trying to destabilize the situation in our country through propaganda. You know, that would be one thing, but let me remind those among Russians who still have at least a few brain cells left in place. Let me remind you that in September 2022, about a week before the mobilization was announced, this same Peskov was assuring everyone in exactly the same way that there would be no mobilization and that all statements claiming it would happen were just provocations from Ukraine. Now, let me remind you. Look, this happened on September 13, 2022. On that day, Dmitry Peskov stated, when he was asked whether the issue of full or partial mobilization was being discussed in the Kremlin, he stated, and I quote, at the moment, no, this is not being discussed. Then, almost a week later, the Kremlin announced a partial mobilization and drafted 300,000 Russian Ivans for the war. That's why you should treat Peskov's statements, with a great deal of skepticism. And finally, the Kremlin decided to take away Russian entrepreneurs' businesses. Peskov stated that Russian businesses are not making enough effort to protect their enterprises from Ukrainian attacks, so they shouldn't be upset about Putin's new decree. Let me remind you, Putin signed a decree the day before, which allows the government to seize and place critical infrastructure facilities under the Federal Agency for State Property Management, whose owners fail to protect them from Ukrainian drone attacks. Another reason for seizing an asset could be, quote, failure to restore or untimely restoration of enterprises. According to Putin's decree, the government will be able to take over almost any enterprise. These include facilities of the fuel and energy sector, utilities, transportation and logistics infrastructure, life support systems, industrial enterprises, as well as, quote, and other facilities of critical importance for ensuring security, the economic stability of the Russian Federation and the people's daily lives. In short, Putin and his gang started the war, and now Russians who are trying to do business there have to defend themselves from Ukraine's retaliatory attacks. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.